Hello there, YouTube. So, I want to discuss genre. Just the nature of genre and categorisation of entertainment mediums. Because that's what this channel has really been about. And if I think about the through line of all the things that I talk about on this channel, whether it's books or films or video games or even role-playing games, the thing that is the through line is categorisation. As people, as humans, we like to categorise things. We like to put things into boxes. We like to label them, and we like to know what we're talking about. And I think that's only evident by the kinds of content we make and watch on YouTube. How many times do you see things like the top 10 horror novels, the top 10 fantasy novels? In video games, how many times will you see things like the best platforms, the best Metroidvania, the best Souls-likes, the best open world games? You can only do this if you can categorise things. But I find genre as a concept to be frustrating. I always have. I found it frustrating for years. There's a video on here where I try to define and drill down what sci-fi is, and that's an example of me just scratching the surface of what genre really is. See, the problem is that I see genre as one of those systems of labelling and categorising that has grown up around the mediums that it's trying to categorise. Each form of entertainment, each art form, each medium of entertainment, each kind of media that we're trying to talk about is categorised slightly differently, but they're all using some level of the same genres. Usually things like action, horror, drama, sci-fi, fantasy, things along those lines. And whilst those are useful terms, they're often stretched and forced in place, and very rarely does anyone go, right, what are the actual key delineation points that we need? And no one really gets a unified theory of categorisation for media. No one really drills down and goes, right, this is where the boundaries are, and this is where things blend from one boundary to another. And the problem is because the boundaries don't really exist. There isn't such a thing as a rigid definition of any one of these genres. They blend from one to another. And that is a real problem. Because when you're just having a casual conversation, if you say, I like action films, you can generally understand what people mean, and that's fine. If you say, I enjoy horror novels, people can generally understand what you mean. But eventually it's going to get to the point where it stops being so clear. If I say, I like playing RPGs, now that's a lot less clear. First of all, do I mean video games? Let's assume that we both know I'm talking about video games, because I could be talking about tabletop RPGs, which that's a whole other kettle of fish. But let's assume we're talking about video games. RPG can mean almost anything now. Do I mean JRPGs? Do I mean Western RPGs? Do I mean ARPGs? Do I mean open world games? Most of those get the RPG label now. Do I mean tactical RPGs? All of these are so different that you wouldn't think they're the same genre to look at them. If I was to show you some of the games that get the RPG label and list them all together, they are so vast and so eclectic, and yet the elements that apparently give them the RPG label are in plenty of other games that generally don't get the RPG label. I can tell you right now, the FIFA games, the football games, they all have leveling systems and statistics and plenty of team micromanagement on par with any RPG that would be labelled under the same system. And they are not called RPGs. So, why aren't they? Why do they not count? This is one of the problems that I've got, is I feel that in order to reasonably label anything, we need to actually redevelop a proper system of categorization. And maybe it's the high functioning autistic in me. Now, this is not something I've gone into detail. I've mentioned it before. It's not something I've gone into detail on. I have ADHD. I was diagnosed as a child. I've been treated for it for years. I was diagnosed with ADHD with high functioning autistic spectrum disorder, which is doctors speak for you're on the spectrum, but we don't quite know exactly where. Now, for me, I like to categorise. I feel very uncomfortable when things aren't categorised. Even as a very young child, if I had a stack of books, I would balance them perfectly with the largest at the bottom and them going up and up in size. I would feel really uncomfortable if they weren't either all the same size or all going up from largest to smallest. Everything from the TV remote, I would want it to be on the table with it this equidistance from the edges of the table, all areas with a right angle, and it parallel to the edges of the table. It would bother me if it wasn't. Things like the volume on the television. Even now, I really hate it if I don't have the volume on an even number. I don't know why, but an even number feels right. An odd number makes me uncomfortable. It used to be that it had to be a multiple of 5. For some reason, that's just how my brain worked. So I have to categorise, I have to order, I have to heavily order everything. I don't know why I do this. Well, I do know why I do this, really. But I don't have a good excuse for doing this. But I know I'm not the only one. The fact that we have so many listicles and the fact that genre means so much to so many people shows that I'm not the only one that wants things ordered. So I feel that we need to rewrite genres. Genres aren't working. They're not useful. Now, for a genre to be useful, it needs to be accessible to the average person, and it needs to be descriptive at a glance. So let's break it down. What is the purpose of genre? Genres describe what is in the media that you are consuming. So whatever the entertainment medium you're going for, let's pick books for now, because it's the easiest one for us to go through. Let's pick novels. It's one of the longest, one of the oldest mediums we can pick, so it's a good one to start with. Now, if we pick a novel and we go, right, what genre is this? It should be relatively easy for us to pick out which genre this is based on some basic criteria. And those criteria should be pretty standardised. And it should be down to what the contents of the narrative is, what the style of the narrative is, what the style of the prose is, so that if we're describing it backwards and forwards, we can, at a glance, tell if one book is similar to another. And for the most part, literary genres do that fine. If I say horror, you have a vague understanding of what a horror novel is. If I say romance, you have a vague understanding of what a romance novel is. And they're fine. And we can have blended genres. We can have a horror romance where it's a horror novel with a heavy romance subplot. And those can merge. That's fine. We can have a fantasy, and we can have a fantasy horror where the fantasy elements and the horror elements blend together. Or we can have a fantasy romance. Common tropes there. That's all fine. I have no issue with that so far. I think we need more strict definitions. I do feel that a lot of the literary genres that we have currently are not properly maintained. We lump way too much stuff in with sci-fi. Space operas, a lot of them are not sci-fi, they're future fantasy. A lot of space operas are fantasy, they're just fantasy in the future. Fantasy does not have to be in an alternative universe or in the past. It can be set in the future. If it's set in the future, that does not make it sci-fi. If it's set in the future, but it's just speculative fiction with no real attempt to explore scientific ideas, it isn't science fiction. Because there's no science in your fiction. Science fiction should be based around science. So that gives you a limit to what is science fiction. It makes the science fiction genre much smaller. Makes fantasy a much larger area. Now, I'm happy for us to divide fantasy up. If fantasy is too broad for people, I'm happy for us to go, right, okay, let's take space opera and make that its own thing. I'm okay with that, because we know what a space opera is. A space opera is much like a western. It's a very niche genre, but it is a futuristic fantasy based in space. Very, very easy. I'm happy for that to be its own genre. I think it should be its own genre. It's not sci-fi. It doesn't care about science. It cares about the interpersonal relationships and the exploration. So let's call space opera its own thing. Same with dystopia. Dystopia is all about politics. It's all about the breakdowns of society and the interpersonal relationships. It has very little to do with science. Now, you could argue it has a lot to do with political science. And yes, political science is in a way a science, but it's a soft science. And I would argue it's not really a science fiction novel at that point. It's political fiction, really. So let's divide off dystopia and have dystopians as their own thing. But at the same point, things like a lot of post-apocalyptic novels would also count as both a sci-fi and a dystopian. But that's fine. You can mix and match. Like I said, if we can have a fantasy romance, we can have a sci-fi dystopia. That's allowed. We can still have them be both. So I think that's where we should go. And that also means we can have a sci-fi space opera. So you can still have a space opera that is also sci-fi. And you can have a fantasy space opera. A space opera that has very magical elements and people using magic and fantastical elements, fantastical creatures in the spaceship. Like, why doesn't that exist? Why aren't there space operas out there with like Tolkien-esque creatures like elves and dwarves and like vampires and that on the spaceships? Why doesn't that exist? Why has no one ever taken a fantasy universe and progressed it to spacefarer? That would be an interesting world. There's so few of them. So those are some of the examples. And I say, why has no one done that? I'm sure loads of people have done that, and I just haven't come across those books. I'm sure plenty of people go, actually, there's all of these many, many novels that have done exactly that. Go ahead and read them. I'm not well read enough to know that. So yeah, that's fine. But that's where I think books are falling down when it comes to genre. But what about non-fiction? Are we counting non-fiction as the same entertainment medium for a start? Are we counting all books as one entertainment medium? Is it all the same thing? For that matter, what about graphic novels or manga? Are they the same medium of entertainment? Do they even count as novels? I would say not really. I'd say they're separate, they're their own thing. The same genres probably apply, but they're separate, they're over here. And we can move novels over and we can bring them over. We can go, do we count graphic novels and manga together? Maybe. I don't read enough of them to know. Maybe we count them together. I don't know if the style, if the cultural influences, if the history and the various different tropes that exist within manga is significant enough, or within Western graphic novels is significant enough to make them noticeably different from each other. Would a modern graphic novel be indistinguishable from a modern manga if we simply took it and had it read from right to left instead of left to right? Quite possibly. Take Frank Miller's Batman. Frank Miller's Batman, you could argue that reads very, very similar to a manga. Like a lot of the more serious action mangas. Yeah, I could see that. So perhaps they're the same. Maybe they are. That's not for me to say. Like I say, the lines that divide these things are not drawn in stone. We never need to draw these things in stone. But what we do need to do is have these be more specified so that they're more useful. Because the whole point of genre labels is to make them useful. It's so that we know what we're talking about. So that's how I think genres should be. Now, the problem there, though, is what about video games? Because video games, they are an an arse when it comes to genres. Now, I think that when it comes to literary genres, we've got literature, and then we can just take it from there, and we can pinpoint various different points where there's clear genre labels that fit. And most of the time, the genre labels are pretty standardised. Most of those genre labels would also fit for film, and the same for TV. But once you add an interactive medium, that's when you've got a problem. And I think I want to discuss this in a separate video, because I want to go into some depth with this. So, this is my first video on the nature of genre and what it means. But I'm going to get into video games separately, because I think video games are so intense when it comes to genre that the struggle of naming video game genres and actually categorising video games, it has transcended the medium completely. So, let's talk about that in the next video, and I'll see you then. Bye.